Okay, I need you to picture something that should genuinely break your brain. You are 13 years old. Maybe you were 13 once. Maybe you know a 13-year-old right now. Imagine that person, not as an abstract concept, but as the actual human being they are or were, being handed a newborn baby and told, "This is yours now. Keep it alive." Also, there are wolves outside. In most places on Earth today, that scenario is somewhere between unthinkable and illegal. We have a word for it, several words actually, and none of them are flattering. But for the overwhelming majority of human history, that wasn't a tragedy, it wasn't a scandal, it was Tuesday, it was the plan. It was, in many cases, the only reason the species made it through the week. So what happened? Did ancient humans just not care about their children? Were they emotionally stunted? Was everyone running around with the judgment of a middle schooler and the responsibilities of a CEO? Or were they dealing with a reality so brutal that starting your family at 13 wasn't just normal, it was survival math? That's what we're doing today. And fair warning, the answer is going to rethink everything you think you know about childhood, adulthood, and why your own ancestors were probably grandparents before they would have been allowed to rent a car today. Let's go.
Here's the thing nobody talks about enough. When you look at the timeline of human evolution, something doesn't add up. And once you notice it, the tidy narrative we tell ourselves about teenagers starts to completely unravel. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, have been around for roughly 300,000 years. For about 290,000 of those years, there were no schools, no driver's ed, no find-yourself gap years, no concept of adolescence as a protected developmental stage where your only job is to grow emotionally and maybe learn algebra. For almost the entire span of human existence, your value to the group was measured in one currency: utility. Could you gather food? Could you process hides? Could you keep a fire going? Could you carry water? Watch a toddler? Spot a predator? And maybe, if you were strong enough, help take down an animal that outweighed your entire family combined. And here's where the math gets genuinely uncomfortable. Life was short, brutally, relentlessly short. The average life expectancy in Paleolithic societies is estimated to have been somewhere between 25 and 35 years. Now, before you picture a world where everyone drops dead at 30, that's not quite how it worked. Infant mortality was astronomical. Violence, infection, childbirth complications, and starvation took huge bites out of the population. If you actually survived childhood, you might live to 50 or even 60. But the key phrase there is, if you survived childhood. Roughly half of all children born in Paleolithic societies died before age 5. Half. Let that sit for a moment. You would have watched siblings die, cousins die, maybe your own first child die. Grief wasn't an occasional visitor, it lived in the tent next door. So, if the clock starts ticking at birth, and the average adult is dead by 30, and half your children aren't going to make it anyway, then waiting till 25 to start your family isn't wisdom. It's a death sentence for your lineage. It's evolutionary malpractice.
But wait, because before we start picturing ancient 13-year-olds as miniature adults, we need to talk about something that complicates the whole story. And yes, it's puberty. We're doing puberty now. The modern assumption is that ancient humans must have hit puberty earlier than we do today. Earlier menarche, earlier sperm production, earlier everything. Because otherwise, how are they having babies at 13? Except the evidence doesn't actually support that neatly. In fact, it suggests the opposite might have been true. Anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, which are our best window into ancestral human biology, suggest that puberty wasn't necessarily earlier.
In many traditional societies, girls reach menarche around 14 or 15, sometimes even later. Boys often follow a similar timeline. Nutrition was worse, body fat percentages were lower. Chronic caloric stress delays reproductive development. So, biologically speaking, a 13-year-old ancient human might not have been any more ready for reproduction than a 13-year-old today. So, how do we square that circle? If puberty wasn't earlier, but people were having babies at 13, what was actually happening? Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The age of reproduction and the age of biological readiness weren't the same thing, and the gap between them was filled by something we don't like to think about: necessity overriding biology. In many ancient societies, the first pregnancy wasn't the ideal, it was the gamble. A 13-year-old girl who survived her first childbirth had proven something critical. She could survive childbirth. That was data. That was valuable information in a world where maternal mortality was one of the leading causes of death for women. The earlier you tested that system, the more time you had to try again if something went wrong. And then there's the other side of the equation, the men, or more accurately, the boys. Because a 13-year-old boy in a hunter-gatherer society wasn't a child in any meaningful social sense. He had been contributing to subsistence for years. He could track animals, he could make tools, he could fight if he had to. The concept of a teenager who is too young for responsibility but too old for play simply didn't exist. It was a straight line from small child to small adult, with no stop in the mall in between.
This is where the whole modern framework collapses. Because the question, why did ancient humans have kids at 13, assumes something that didn't exist: the teenager. We invented adolescence. And I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean we literally invented it. The concept of a developmental stage between childhood and adulthood where a person is physically mature but socially and economically dependent is a creation of industrialized society. It is maybe 200 years old, tops. Before that, you were a child, and then you were an adult. And the line between those two things was crossed when you could perform adult labor. Not when you felt ready, not when you had found yourself, when you could do the work. In ancient foraging societies, children started contributing to the group's survival almost as soon as they could walk. By age 5, they were gathering small items, fetching water, watching younger children. By age 10, they were effectively apprentices in whatever skills their environment demanded. And by age 13, they weren't kids having kids, they were adults having kids, because the category of kid had expired. This is genuinely hard for modern people to process. We have so thoroughly internalized the idea of extended childhood that we look at a 13-year-old and see someone who needs protection from adult responsibilities. And that's not wrong in our context, but our context is a blip, a luxury, a historical anomaly made possible by supermarkets, antibiotics, and Social Security. Your ancestors didn't have the luxury of a protected adolescence. They had winters, they had predators, they had the constant grinding pressure of finding enough calories to keep everyone breathing. In that world, a 13-year-old with adult capabilities wasn't a tragedy, they were a solution.
But here's the part that really drives the point home. And it's not romantic. It's not about love or tradition or cultural values. It's about economics so brutal they make modern capitalism look like a spa day. In a world without banks, without pensions, without written deeds to property, your children were your retirement plan. They were your insurance policy. They were your only guarantee that someone would still be bringing you food when your knees gave out and you couldn't walk 10 kilometers to the next water source. This creates a mathematical imperative that is almost mechanical.
The earlier you start, the more children you can potentially have before your body gives out. The more children you have, the higher the probability that some of them survive to adulthood. The more adults in your family network, the more likely you are to survive your own old age. It's a pyramid scheme, but the only kind that actually worked, and the entry fee was your youth. Think about what that means for a second. A woman who had her first child at 13 could, in theory, have 6 or 7 children by her mid-20s. If 2 or 3 of them survived, she had a support network. If she waited until 20, she might have 3 children before her fertility declined or before she died. The math is ruthless. The math doesn't care about your feelings. The math says, start early or don't start at all. And the men? A 13-year-old boy who could hunt, fight, and father children wasn't starting too young. He was becoming an asset. In many societies, his ability to provide for a family was the entire basis of his social standing. There was no college years to figure it out. The tribe couldn't afford to feed someone who wasn't producing for a decade while they found themselves.
But let's be honest about what they were facing, because this is where the romanticized version of ancient life falls apart. Childbirth in the ancient world was one of the most dangerous things a human being could do. No antibiotics, no sterile environments, no understanding of germ theory, no emergency C-sections. If the baby was breech, that was often the end. If there was hemorrhaging, there was nothing anyone could do. If infection set in, you died, slowly, painfully, and surrounded by people who loved you but were powerless to help. And yet women did it anyway, over and over, not because they were reckless, not because they didn't understand the risks, but because the alternative, having no children, having no one to care for you, having your genetic line and your social security evaporate, was worse. The anthropologist Kristen Hawkes, who developed the grandmother hypothesis we touched on earlier, found something fascinating in her studies of modern foraging groups. The presence of a grandmother significantly increased child survival rates. But here's the catch. That grandmother had to exist, which meant someone had to have given birth to her, and given birth early enough that she was still alive and functional when her grandchildren arrived. The entire system depended on compressed generations. If you waited until 25 to have your first child, your mother might be dead before your children were born. If you started at 13, your mother, experienced, knowledgeable, still strong, was right there. She could nurse the baby if you couldn't. She could spot the signs of infection. She could teach you what no one else could. The early birth wasn't just about you. It was about keeping the entire support structure intact. And then there's the other mortality clock, the one ticking for the men. Violence wasn't an occasional tragedy in the ancient world. It was a constant occupational hazard. Hunting accidents, intergroup conflict, predators, infection from minor wounds. Men died young, often. If you were a woman, waiting for the perfect partner or the right time wasn't a strategy, it was a fantasy. You partnered with whoever was available, capable, and alive, and you did it as soon as biology allowed, because the window of opportunity was narrow and could close without warning. Okay, so here's where the tidy narrative starts to unravel, because I just spent 10 minutes explaining why ancient humans had to have kids at 13, and now I'm going to tell you that they might not have been as young as we think, at least not in the way we imagine. The archaeological evidence for the age of first birth in prehistoric societies is actually incredibly thin. We have skeletal remains, and we can sometimes tell if a female pelvis shows signs of childbirth, but determining exact age at first birth, that's mostly inference. It's looking at modern hunter-gatherer societies and projecting backward. It's educated guesswork dressed up as certainty. And here's something genuinely interesting.
In some ancient societies, the age of first reproduction might have been closer to 16 or 17 than 13. Still young by modern standards, still a child in our eyes, but not the barely pubescent scenario we tend to imagine. The 13 number gets thrown around because it's shocking, because it makes us feel advanced and civilized by comparison, because it fits a narrative about how far we've come. But the reality was probably messier. Some started very young, some started in their late teens, some never started at all because they died first. What we do know is that the social pressure to reproduce early was immense. Whether that meant 13 or 17 probably varied by environment, by nutrition, by social structure, and by sheer luck. The ancient world wasn't uniform. A woman in a resource-rich river valley with steady food and low disease pressure might have had a different timeline than a woman on a marginal grassland scraping by on whatever roots she could dig up. So the real answer to why did ancient humans have kids at 13 might be some of them did because they had to, and some of them didn't because they couldn't. And we flattened that entire complex reality into a single shocking number because it's easier to tell that story.
But here's the question that keeps me up at night. If ancient humans didn't have teenagers, and we do, did we discover something they missed? Or did we invent something they couldn't afford? The answer is probably both. Modern adolescence exists because we can afford it. We have enough surplus of food, of safety, of knowledge that we can keep human beings in a protected state for an extra decade while their brains finish developing. And that is objectively a good thing. The prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until around age 25. Ancient 13-year-olds making life or death decisions were doing it with neural hardware that wasn't finished cooking. We know that now. They didn't. But there's a cost to our invention that we don't talk about enough. In creating adolescence, we also created a kind of limbo, a decade where you are biologically adult but socially infantilized, where you have adult desires, adult hormones, and adult awareness, but none of the corresponding responsibilities or privileges, where you are told to be a kid while your body is screaming at you that it's ready for things society says you're not allowed to have yet. Ancient humans didn't have that limbo. The line was sharp, and maybe, just maybe, that clarity was less psychologically damaging than the ambiguity we hand to modern teenagers. A 13-year-old in the ancient world who was raising a child had status, purpose, a defined role. A modern 13-year-old in the same biological state has TikTok and algebra and a vague promise that all of this will make sense eventually. I'm not saying we should go back, absolutely not. The ancient system was built on mortality rates that would make you weep. But I am saying that our way isn't the only way, and that the concept of a child is far more fluid than we pretend. You are doing this right now, or rather, you're not doing it, and that's the point. If you're watching this video, you almost certainly did not have a child at 13. You probably didn't have one at 18, maybe not at 25, maybe not at all. And that choice, or that delay, is a luxury that would have been literally incomprehensible to your ancestors. Every single one of your direct ancestors, going back 300,000 years, lived in a world where reproduction wasn't a choice, it was gravity. It was the default setting of human existence. And they all reproduced early enough and often enough that the chain never broke, not once. If even one of them had waited too long or chosen not to, you would not exist. The fact that you can even ask the question, should I have kids, and treat it as a genuine decision rather than a biological imperative, is maybe the most radical departure from the human baseline that has ever happened.
We didn't just extend childhood, we made reproduction optional. We made it elective. We built a world where a human being can live an entire life without ever once participating in the one behavior that defined every previous generation. And your ancestors, those 13-year-olds with babies on their hips, those 15-year-olds tracking mammoths across frozen steppes, those 17-year-olds burying their second child and trying again, they would not recognize you. They would look at your life with its decades of protected development, its medical interventions, its deliberate childlessness, and they would think you were either gods or ghosts.
So here's what I want to know. If you had been born 10,000 years ago, same brain, same body, same basic you, but without the supermarkets and the antibiotics and the social safety nets, do you think you would have survived to 13? And if you had, do you think you would have been ready for what came next? Or is ready just another word for the luxury of having a choice? Let me know in the comments. Until then, I'll see you in the next one.